I remember the day they came to our hive block, though I wish the Emperor had granted me the mercy of forgetting. It was a Tuesday, or what passed for Tuesday in the endless industrial churn of Hive Tertius. The warning klaxons had sounded at dawn, their wail cutting through the perpetual mechanical thunder that was the only lullaby we ever knew. My mother had clutched me tighter than usual that morning, her fingers digging into my shoulders hard enough to bruise, though I didn't understand why until I saw her face. She had heard the rumors, you see. Everyone in the lower Habs had heard them. The black ships were coming. I was 12 standard years old. 12 years of breathing recycled air that tasted of rust and promethium, of eating protein paste extruded from algae vats, of sleeping in a Hab unit so cramped that my 3 siblings and I shared the same mattress in shifts. It wasn't much of a life, but it was my life. It was all I knew. And on that Tuesday morning, as the klaxons screamed and my mother wept into her hands, I learned that even that miserable existence could be taken away. The ships descended through the smog at midday, though you couldn't see the sun through the toxic haze that perpetually shrouded our city. They were massive, void black and silent except for the thrumming of their gravity engines, a sound that made your teeth ache and your bladder weaken. I watched from our Hab unit's single window, my face pressed against the grimy plexiglass as they settled like carrion birds onto the landing platforms 3 levels above us. My father had already left for his shift at the manufactorum. He never said goodbye. I wonder if he knew somehow that I wouldn't be there when he returned. The knock came an hour later. Not a polite knock, the hammering of powered fists against our door, the kind that said resistance was not an option, that compliance was assumed, that our lives were merely data points in a ledger kept by men who would never know our names. My mother screamed when she opened it. I don't blame her. They stood in the corridor like statues carved from shadow, 3 figures in robes the color of midnight, their faces hidden behind silver masks that reflected nothing, revealed nothing. But it wasn't the robes or the masks that made my bowels clench with terror. It was their eyes. Even behind the masks, I could feel their eyes on me, and there was something wrong with them. Something that looked past flesh and bone into the secret places where thoughts lived. One of them raised a hand, a withered ancient thing wrapped in black cloth, and pointed directly at me. "The child," they said. Their voice was a chorus, multiple tones layered impossibly over one another as if several people were speaking through the same throat. "The child is Psychically, latent, class 3 theta by estimation, suitable for tithe." I didn't understand the words. I only understood that my mother collapsed, that she grabbed my legs and wouldn't let go, that she was babbling prayers to the Emperor I had heard her recite every night but never truly listened to. Behind the robed figures, I saw Arbites in their carapace armor, their hands resting on shock mauls, their expressions bored. This was routine for them. They'd done this 1,000 times before. "Please," my mother begged, her voice breaking. "Please, he's just a child. He's good. He works hard. He's never shown any signs of—" "Mutation," one of the psychers interrupted, the word hanging in the air like a curse. "You would hide a witch from the Emperor's judgment? You would doom your hive to demonic incursion because of maternal sentiment?" She had no answer to that. None of us did. In the Imperium, there are no appeals, no second chances, no mercy for those touched by the warp. I had learned this in the Schola classes, in the sermons from the Ministorum priests who visited our Hab block once a month to remind us of our duty, our insignificance, our expendability in the face of humanity's survival. I had always assumed those lessons applied to other people, not to me. They took me that day, shackled me with restraints that hummed with suppression fields that made my skull ache, though at the time I didn't understand why. I was herded into the corridor with 17 other children from our block, some younger than me, some older. A girl named Kessa, who lived 2 units down, was among them. We'd played together in the recycling yards when we were small. She wouldn't look at me now. Her eyes were glazed, her face blank with shock. The march to the landing platforms took 2 hours, though it felt like days. The robed psychers led us in silence, flanked by Arbites who prodded anyone who slowed with their mauls. The crowds parted before us, parents and neighbors watching with expressions that mixed pity with relief. Pity that we were being taken, relief that it wasn't their children. No one tried to stop them. No one even spoke. To interfere with the psyker tithe was heresy, and heresy meant death not just for you but for everyone you'd ever known. I remember looking back once, seeing my mother's face in the crowd. She had followed us, pushed through the mass of bodies to watch me go. She wasn't crying anymore. Her face was empty, carved hollow, as if someone had reached inside and scooped out everything that made her human. I wanted to call out to her, to tell her I was sorry for whatever I'd done, for whatever genetic curse had marked me, but my throat was closed, my tongue leaden. I never saw her again. The black ships loomed above us as we climbed the rusty stairwells to the landing platforms. Up close they were even more terrible, their hulls covered in Gothic script I couldn't read, in purity seals the size of hab units, in gargoyles whose eyes seemed to follow us as we passed. The air around them was cold, colder than anything should be in the sweltering belly of a hive city, and it smelled of ozone and something else, something that made my skin crawl and my mind recoil. They loaded us into the ship's belly through a boarding ramp wide enough for cargo haulers. Inside was worse than outside. The space was cavernous, lit by flickering lumens that cast everything in shades of sickly green. Hundreds of children were already there, seated in rows of iron benches, their wrists bound to restraint rails that ran the length of the chamber. Some were crying. Most were silent. A few were screaming, wild-eyed and thrashing, until servitors, lobotomized humans more machine than flesh, injected them with something that made them go limp. I was seated between a boy who couldn't have been more than 8 and a girl about my age whose eyes were already starting to glow with the telltale shimmer of emerging psychic talent. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them looked at me. We were already learning the first lesson of our new existence. We were alone, each of us, no matter how many bodies pressed around us. The ramp sealed with a hydraulic hiss that echoed through the chamber like the closing of a tomb. The lumens flickered once, twice, then stabilized into a steady, oppressive glare. I felt the engines engage, felt them in my bones, in my teeth, in the marrow of my spine. The ship was lifting. I pressed my face against the cold iron of the bench in front of me and closed my eyes, trying to hold on to the memory of home, of my mother's face, of the smell of our hab unit, mildew and cooking oil and humanity packed too tight. But already it was fading, slipping away like water through fingers, replaced by fear and the certainty that wherever this ship was taking us, it was a place from which no one returned. As the black ship broke atmosphere and the gravity shifted sickeningly beneath us, I took my last breath of home, recycled air thick with promethium fumes and the accumulated desperation of billions, and felt something inside me break that would never be repaired. I was no longer a child with a name and a mother and a future. I was Psychana, tainted, marked. I was the Imperium's property now, and the Imperium does not grant mercy to its tools. Time ceased to have meaning in the belly of the black ship. They moved us from the loading chamber after the first day, or what I believed was a day, though there was no way to tell in the unchanging glare of the lumens. The servitors came with their lurching mechanical gait, their lobotomized faces slack and drooling, and herded us deeper into the ship's bowels. We descended through corridors that grew progressively narrower, darker, colder, until we reached the holding cells. I want you to understand what that meant. When I say holding cells, your mind might conjure images of prison blocks, of barred doors and stone walls. What we were sealed into was nothing so generous. They were coffins, vertical metal tubes barely wide enough for a child's body, stacked in rows that stretched into darkness beyond counting. Each tube had a single breathing slit, a waste elimination port, and a feeding tube that would extend at intervals to pump nutrient paste directly into our mouths whether we wanted it or not. They sealed me inside mine without ceremony. The door clanged shut, and the darkness that followed was absolute. Not the darkness of a room at night, but the darkness of a grave, of a void, of a place where light had never existed and never would. I screamed until my throat bled. I hammered against the walls until my knuckles broke. The metal didn't even dent. Eventually I stopped. You always stop. The human body has limits, and when you reach them, something inside you simply gives up, accepts, surrenders to the inevitable. The feeding tube came at irregular intervals. I learned to dread its arrival, the metallic scraping as it extended, the cold rubber pressing against my lips. Then the forced invasion of my mouth as it pumped gray sludge down my throat. The paste tasted like rust and spoiled fat, and if I gagged it back up, the tube would simply wait and then force-feed me again. After the third time choking on my own vomit, I learned to swallow. The waste port was worse. I'll spare you the details, but imagine the indignity of being a 12-year-old child. Unable to control when or how your body functions, your waste sucked away by hissing machinery while you stand in your own filth until the cleansing cycle engaged. We were animals being transported, less than animals. At least livestock were given room to move. But the worst part, the part that still haunts me in whatever passes for dreams in my current existence, was the psychic dampening field. I hadn't understood what I was before they took me. I'd never consciously used whatever gift or curse lurked in my genetics. But the moment they activated the dampening field, I felt it, like a band of iron tightening around my skull, like someone had reached into my brain and was squeezing it with both hands. The pressure was constant, unrelenting, a migraine that never ended, never even diminished. It pressed against the inside of my forehead, my temples, the base of my skull, until I was certain my head would simply crack open like an egg. And yet, paradoxically, that pressure was the only thing keeping us alive. I learned this from the screaming. The first time I heard it, I thought someone was being tortured. A high, wavering shriek that cut through the engine's rumble like a knife through flesh. It went on for hours, rising and falling in pitch, occasionally forming words in languages I didn't recognize. Then it stopped. Not gradually, just stopped, cut off mid-cry, followed by a wet, tearing sound and the smell of burning meat filtering through the ventilation. It happened again 3 days later. And again. And again. Some pattern I couldn't discern, some lottery of the damned where children's minds would simply break. Snap under the pressure of gifts they couldn't control, suppressed by fields they couldn't escape. Their psyches would fragment, and in fragmenting they would tear holes in reality itself. Brief, localized warp breaches that the ship's systems would immediately cauterize with extreme prejudice. I later learned that the dampening fields were calibrated to a threshold, strong enough to suppress most psychic activity, weak enough that we wouldn't all suffocate from our own suppressed power turning inward. But some children were stronger than others. Some burned too hot to be safely contained. When the suppressors couldn't hold them, the ship's automated defense systems would flood their cells with superheated plasma, incinerating them and sealing the breach before anything from the warp could slip through. We could hear them dying. All of us sealed in our metal coffins, listening to our fellow prisoners being cooked alive because their gifts were too powerful to contain. And we knew with the certainty of the doomed, that any of us could be next. I learned to make my mind small. I don't know how else to describe it. I would retreat into myself, into some quiet corner of my consciousness, and make myself insignificant. Not thinking, not feeling, barely existing. Just a spark of awareness in an ocean of nothing, hoping that whatever detection systems monitored us would overlook me, would find me too weak to worry about, too negligible to kill. It worked, or perhaps I was simply lucky. Perhaps my gift, my curse, was minor enough that the dampeners held me without straining. I'll never know. But even in that diminished state, even making myself as small as possible, I still dreamed. The nightmares came during the sleep cycles, when whatever drugs they mixed into the nutrient paste dragged me under into unconsciousness. In those dreams, I wasn't in the cell anymore. I was floating in an ocean of impossible colors. Colors that had no names, that hurt to perceive. Things swam in that ocean. Vast shapes that moved through dimensions my mind couldn't properly process. Their forms shifting and writhing, covered in eyes and mouths and appendages that terminated in screaming faces. They pressed against the ship. I could feel them. Feel their hunger. Their desperate, insane need to break through the barriers that separated their realm from ours. The Geller field, I didn't know that term then, but I felt it, was the only thing between us and them. A soap bubble of reality stretched across an infinite void of unreality. And it was thin, so desperately, terrifyingly thin. Sometimes in the dreams I could hear them, whispers in my mind offering things, promising things. They knew my name, my real name, the one I'd been born with, the one I was desperately trying to forget. They spoke it with affection, with love, with the seductive kindness that a predator shows prey it's trying to lure closer. They told me they could end my suffering. They told me they could give me power, freedom, sight beyond sight. All I had to do was open myself to them just a little, just enough. I never did, not because I was strong, but because I was too terrified to do anything but keep myself locked down, sealed away, hidden in the smallest corner of my own psyche. How long did the journey last? I don't know. Months, certainly, perhaps years. Without day or night, without any reference beyond the irregular arrival of the feeding tube, time became meaningless. I forgot what sunlight looked like, even the dim, filtered sunlight of the hive. I forgot colors. I forgot the sound of my own voice, having not spoken aloud since they sealed me in. Most significantly, I forgot my family. My mother's face became a blur, then a shadow, then nothing. My siblings' names slipped away one by one. My father. Had I even had a father? The memories dissolved like sugar in water, leaving only the vague sense that there had been a before, though what that before contained was lost to me. By the time we reached Holy Terra, I had been reduced to my essentials: fear, hunger, pain, and the animal determination to survive one more feeding cycle, one more sleep, one more endless stretch of darkness. When they finally opened my cell, when light, real light, even the harsh artificial glare of the ship's interior hit my face for the first time in months or years, I couldn't even scream. My vocal cords had atrophied from disuse. I could only make a thin, wheezing sound as the servitors pulled me out of my coffin and let me collapse onto the deck plating. I lay there, my muscles useless, my bones aching, my eyes streaming tears from the unbearable brightness of the lumens. Around me, other children were being extracted from their cells, those who had survived at least. We looked like corpses, pale, skeletal, our hair falling out in clumps, our skin covered in sores from months of standing in our own waste. But we had made it. We had crossed the galaxy in the belly of a black ship, passed through the warp itself and emerged on the other side. I learned later that of the 400 children loaded onto that ship from my hive alone, fewer than 200 reached Terra alive. The others had either broken under the pressure and been purged, or had simply died from the conditions. Their bodies too weak, their minds too fragile, their will insufficient to endure. The servitors dragged us through corridors toward processing chambers. And through the viewports I caught my first glimpse of holy Terra, the throne world, humanity's birthplace and eternal capital. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. It was the most terrible thing I had ever seen. And I knew, with the certainty that only the truly damned possess, that whatever awaited us there would make the journey seem kind by comparison. They gave us 3 days to recover before the soul binding. 3 days in a Medicae facility deep beneath the Imperial Palace where servitors tended to our bodies with mechanical efficiency, rehydrating us, treating our sores, forcing nutrients into our wasted frames through intravenous tubes. They shaved our heads, scrubbed our skin raw with chemical cleansers, and dressed us in simple white robes that felt impossibly soft after months in our own filth. I could walk again by the second day, though my legs trembled with every step. I could speak, though my voice was a ruined croak. Around me, the other survivors from my ship were similarly recovering. Hollow-eyed children who moved like ghosts, who flinched at every sound, who hadn't yet processed that the journey was over. We didn't speak to each other. There was nothing to say. On the third day they came for us. Not the servitors this time, but priests. Dozens of them dressed in crimson robes adorned with golden aquilas and purity seals that rustled like dying leaves as they moved. They carried censers that billowed sweet-smelling smoke, incense meant to purify, to sanctify, to prepare us for what was coming. They herded us, there's no other word for it, through corridors of black marble veined with gold, through halls so vast that their ceilings disappeared into shadow far above. The walls were covered in murals depicting the Emperor's great works, the unification, the Great Crusade, scenes of battle and conquest and faith rendered in such detail that the figures seemed to move in the flickering torchlight. We descended, down and down, through levels that grew progressively older, the architecture shifting from the Baroque grandeur of the upper palace to something more ancient, more fundamental. The air grew thick, heavy with power that made my skin crawl and my suppressed gift writhe inside my skull like a living thing trying to escape. Other groups joined us as we descended, children from other ships, other hives, other worlds. By the time we reached the chamber of soul binding, there were hundreds of us, a river of white-robed children flowing through corridors of black stone toward a destination we could feel but not see, could sense but not comprehend. The chamber itself defied description. It was vast, large enough to swallow hab-blocks, large enough that the far walls were lost in haze. The floor was inscribed with geometric patterns that hurt to look at, lines and circles and symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when you weren't looking directly at them. The ceiling was invisible, lost in darkness, punctuated by hanging censers the size of cargo haulers, each one billowing smoke that gathered overhead like storm clouds. But all of this, the vastness, the architecture, the overwhelming scale, was rendered insignificant by the light. At the chamber's far end, behind blast doors as thick as fortress walls, behind psychic shielding that made the air shimmer and warp, was the golden throne, and upon it sat the God Emperor of mankind. I couldn't see him. None of us could. The radiance that emanated from that distant chamber was too bright, too pure, too utterly overwhelming for human eyes to process. It was like staring into a sun, except this sun was aware of you, knew you, saw into every corner of your soul with an intensity that was simultaneously terrifying and transcendent. I fell to my knees. We all did, not because we were told to, but because our bodies simply gave out, overwhelmed by proximity to something so far beyond human comprehension that our minds couldn't process it as anything but divinity. The priests were chanting now, their voices rising in hymns I didn't recognize, in high Gothic that my limited education couldn't parse. The sound washed over us in waves, and with each wave I felt the suppression fields that had caged my gift for months beginning to loosen, to peel away, exposing the raw psychic potential beneath. It was agony. Imagine spending months with your hand held in a fist so tight that the muscles had locked, frozen in that position. Now imagine someone forcing that fist open, prying the fingers apart one by one, tearing tendons and ligaments as they went. That's what it felt like as they stripped away the suppressors, and my gift, my curse, unfurled inside my mind for the first time in its full, terrible glory. I could see things, not with my eyes, those were clenched shut against the searing light, but with some other sense, some awareness that had been dormant until now. I could see the other children around me, their souls burning like candles in the darkness. I could see the priests, their faith like armor encasing their psyches, and I could see through the walls, through the barriers, into the seething madness of the warp beyond reality, where things that had no names and no forms pressed against existence itself, hungry and eternal and utterly incomprehensibly alien. They called us forward in groups of 30. I was in the fourth group, herded toward the blast doors by servitors whose minds were blessedly, mercifully blank. Empty spaces where consciousness should have been, offering relief from the overwhelming psychic noise of hundreds of untrained psychers awakening simultaneously. The ritual chamber beyond the doors was smaller, more focused. The light here was brighter still, focused through crystalline lenses and psychic amplifiers into a beam of pure, concentrated will that emanated from the golden throne itself. The air smelled of ozone and burning metal and something else, something organic. The smell of previous ceremonies of charred flesh and boiled fluids and sanctified death. They positioned us in a circle, our backs to each other, facing outward toward the light. Priests moved among us, anointing our foreheads with oils that burned cold against our skin, murmuring prayers in languages older than the Imperium itself. I was shaking uncontrollably now, my teeth chattering, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run, to flee, to do anything but stand here waiting for what was coming. But there was nowhere to run. There had never been anywhere to run. The first boy started screaming before they even began. His mind, unable to handle the proximity to such overwhelming power, simply shattered. He collapsed, blood streaming from his eyes and nose and ears, his body convulsing. The servitors dragged him away efficiently, leaving a smear of red across the inscribed floor. The ceremony continued without pause. When my turn came, I felt it before it happened, a gathering of pressure, a focusing of attention, as if the sun itself had decided to notice me specifically. The priests raised their hands, completing some gesture I couldn't see, and suddenly there was a connection. A channel opened between the golden throne and my mind, and through it poured a fragment, an infinitesimally small fragment of the Emperor's infinite consciousness. I want to tell you what it felt like. I want to find words that could convey the experience. But language fails. Human cognition fails. It was like having your skull filled with molten gold. It was like every neuron firing at once. It was like being simultaneously born and dying, created and destroyed, judged and found wanting, and remade in fire. The Emperor's will scoured through my psyche like a cleansing flame, burning away impurities, weaknesses, the soft parts of me that made me human. I felt my sanity cracking under the pressure, felt parts of my identity simply vaporizing in the heat. I screamed in languages I had never learned, words bubbling up from some deep genetic memory or perhaps from the warp itself. And I felt my eyes burning, not metaphorically, actually burning. The vitreous fluid boiling, the lenses melting, the optic nerves searing away into ash. I clawed at my face, trying to stop it, but servitors grabbed my arms and held them immobile as my eyes liquefied in their sockets and ran down my cheeks like tears. The last thing I saw with physical sight was light. Just light, pure and endless and absolute, then darkness, permanent, final. But even as my physical eyes died, even as I went blind to the material world forever, I became aware of something else. New senses awakening, new sight opening. I could see the warp now, see it constantly overlaid across reality like a second vision I could never close or turn away from. I could see the flows and eddies of psychic energy, the currents of emotion and thought that swirled through the immaterium like weather patterns on an infinite ocean. And I could see things moving in that ocean. Predators. Always watching. Always waiting. The connection to the throne severed as suddenly as it had formed, and I collapsed. I was dimly aware of being dragged from the chamber, of being laid out in rows with others who had survived, though survived seemed a generous term for what we had become. Of the 30 children who entered the soul-binding chamber with me, 12 emerged alive. 12 blind, broken, fundamentally altered creatures who were no longer quite human, no longer quite sane, no longer capable of living anything resembling a normal life. We had been soul-bound to the Emperor, our psyches strengthened against demonic predation by having his will burned directly into our consciousness. We would never be possessed, never be corrupted, never be anything but extensions of his divine purpose. We were astropaths now. Psychic communication nodes in the vast network that held the Imperium together across impossible distances. We were tools, weapons, resources to be expended in humanity's endless war for survival. I lay on the cold stone floor, blind and weeping blood from my ruined eye sockets, and understood with perfect clarity that my life, my real life, the one where I had choices and agency and the possibility of happiness, had ended. What remained was only service, suffering, and the slow dissolution of everything I had once been into something useful to the Imperium. The Emperor protects, the priests whispered as they tended to us. But from him I was learning there is no protection. They gave me new eyes, not real eyes. I would never see the material world again. But they fitted me with augmetic replacements, smooth spheres of black glass set into my sockets, more for the comfort of others than for any function I required. People found empty eye sockets disturbing, I learned. The glass orbs were a kindness, a lie that let them pretend I was still human when they looked at me. I didn't need them. I could see perfectly well now, though what I saw bore little resemblance to sight as I had once known it. The world appeared to me as layers, the physical realm a dim gray shadow overlaid with the brilliant churning colors of the warp. Souls burned like candles wherever I turned my attention. Emotions rippled through the immaterium like stones thrown in a pond, and everywhere, lurking at the edges of perception, were the things that lived in that other realm, watching, waiting, hungry. My training began 3 days after the soul binding, as soon as my body had stabilized enough to walk. They brought all 12 of us who had survived from my group, to the astropathic chambers deep beneath the Imperial Palace. How deep I never learned. We descended for hours through levels carved from the bedrock of Terra itself, through sections that predated the Imperium, predated the age of strife, predated perhaps even old night itself. The chambers were vast beyond comprehension, Thousands of alcoves carved into rock walls that stretched up and up into darkness, each alcove containing a meditation cell where an astropath would sit and scream thoughts into the void. The air was thick with incense meant to focus the mind and suppress emotional turbulence. The walls were covered in inscriptions, names, millions of names, carved in tiny script that covered every surface. The dead, I learned. Every astropath who had burned out their life in service to the Imperium commemorated here in the place where they had learned their terrible craft. Our instructors were ancient things that might once have been human but had calcified into something else through decades of psychic trauma. Their bodies were twisted, bent, their skin like aged parchment stretched over frames that had warped in ways anatomy shouldn't allow. Some had additional limbs, not augmetics but growths, mutations tolerated because of their service, because they were too valuable to purge despite their deviations from human standard. They didn't speak aloud. They had no need to. Instead, they projected their thoughts directly into our minds, cold. Clinical instructions delivered with the emotional warmth of a servitor's programming. You will learn to send, they told us. You will learn to receive. You will learn to encode your thoughts in psychic cipher so that they cannot be intercepted by the enemy. You will learn to navigate the warp without being devoured by the things that dwell there. And you will learn to accept that every transmission shortens your life by degrees you cannot measure but will inevitably accumulate until you burn out completely. This is your purpose. This is your function. This is all you will ever be. The training was systematic, brutal, and utterly without mercy. They started with sending, the relatively simpler task of projecting thoughts outward into the warp. We would sit in our meditation cells, eyes closed, though for me this made no difference, and attempt to push messages through the barrier between reality and unreality. Simple messages at first, numbers, colors, basic concepts. It felt like vomiting through your forehead, like giving birth to thoughts that tore their way out of your skull, trailing blood and cerebrospinal fluid. The first time I successfully sent a message, the number 7 burning it into the warp with enough force that the instructor could receive it 3 chambers away. I hemorrhaged from my nose for 6 hours and woke up in the medic bay with pressure in my skull so intense I wished they had let me die. But I had succeeded, and success meant we would do it again, and again, and again until the impossible became merely agonizing, until agony became routine, until routine became the only reality we knew. Receiving was worse. To receive, you had to open yourself to the warp, had to lower your defenses, quiet your own thoughts, and become receptive to the psychic transmissions of others. This meant you became receptive to everything, not just the intended messages, but the background psychic noise of the immaterium itself. Emotions from across the sector bleeding through. Dying screams from battlefields light years away. And always, always the whispers of the things that hunted the warp, looking for any opening, any weakness, any moment of inattention that would let them slip through. 3 students died in the first month. 2 were taken by demonic entities that found purchase in their opened minds and had to be purged, burned alive in sanctified fire while priests chanted hymns to drown out their screaming. The 3rd simply stopped. His mind went elsewhere and never came back, leaving his body a breathing husk that the servitors eventually carted away. I learned to build walls in my mind, defenses, psychic structures that could filter out the noise, that could let intended messages through while keeping the predators at bay. It was like learning to hear a whisper in a hurricane. You had to develop a kind of selective attention that bordered on the supernatural, had to train your consciousness to operate on multiple levels simultaneously. The instructors pushed us without respite. Each practice session lasted 8 hours minimum, often longer. We would send and receive, pushing messages across progressively greater distances, from chamber to chamber, then across the palace, then across Terra itself, then to Luna, then to the system's edge where practice ships waited to relay our transmissions back. Each transmission felt like it was killing me. My brain would swell against my skull until I was certain it would rupture. My nose bled constantly. I grew accustomed to the taste of copper, to the feeling of hot liquid running down my throat. My hands trembled uncontrollably during rest periods. I lost weight despite the nutrient-rich diet they fed us, my body consuming itself to fuel the psychic exertions they demanded. But I survived. I learned. I grew stronger, or perhaps not stronger, but more hardened, more calloused, more capable of enduring what should have been unendurable. They taught us to encode our messages in psychic cipher, complex thought patterns that could only be decoded by other trained astropaths, rendering our transmissions unintelligible to any entities that might intercept them in the warp. They taught us to navigate the currents of the immaterium, to find the most efficient paths through its ever-shifting topology, to avoid the eddies and whirlpools where demons congregated. And they taught us to accept our mortality. Every transmission burns your life force, the instructors told us. Every time you open yourself to the warp, you are damaged in ways that cannot be healed. The stronger the message, the greater the distance. The more of yourself you consume. An astropath's lifespan averages 37 standard years from soul binding. The record is 82. The shortest was 4 days. You are tools. When you break, you will be replaced. This is acceptable. This is necessary. This is the price of keeping the Imperium connected across the void. I watched my fellow students dying around me. Not quickly like those taken by demons, but slowly, incrementally worn down by the cumulative trauma of daily practice. A boy named Corvin, who had been soul-bound with me, began having seizures during his 4th month of training. By the 6th month, he could no longer form coherent thoughts. By the 7th, he was dead, his brain simply giving out, exhausted beyond any capacity to function. A girl named Tessa went blind, truly blind, losing even her warp sight, locked in absolute sensory deprivation while her mind still functioned. They kept training her anyway, teaching her to send and receive by feel alone until she walked into a wall during a rest period and didn't stop walking. Just kept pushing forward until her skull cracked and she collapsed. The instructors showed no emotion at these deaths. They simply made notations in their data slates and continued the curriculum with the survivors. 5 years. That's how long the training lasted. 5 years of daily psychic trauma, of watching my cohort dwindle from 12 to 8 to 6 to 4, of feeling my own mind crystallizing into something hard and functional and utterly divorced from the child I had once been. When they finally declared my training complete, when they assigned me my astropathic classification and posting, I felt nothing, no relief, no pride, no fear. Just a hollow acceptance that this was my existence now, to sit in a chamber and scream thoughts into the void until my mind burned out and they carved my name onto the walls with all the others. The chamber walls were covered in names, billions of names, carved in script so small you needed magnification to read them. Every astropath who had served and died commemorated in stone. There was space there for my name too. I knew it was only a matter of time before someone carved it. My posting came on a Tuesday. I still tracked the days by Terra's calendar, though it was a meaningless habit, a vestige of the child I had been, clinging to routine because it was the only constant in a universe that had stripped away everything else. The assignment officer was a wizened man whose augmetic throat clicked in word when he spoke. He didn't look at me when he delivered my orders. Nobody looked at astropaths directly if they could help it. Something about our ruined eyes and the way we moved, our heads tilting to track things that weren't there, unsettled even hardened Imperial functionaries. Agri-world. Designation Harvest 77 Secundus, Segmentum Obscurus, Tartus Sector, bordering the Halo stars. His voice was mechanical, efficient. Population 4 billion, strategic value, tertiary food production, astropathic presence, sole primary, 3 auxiliaries deceased in the last rotation. You will replace the primary. I said nothing. There was nothing to say. Astropaths didn't refuse assignments. We went where we were sent, served until we burned out, and died wherever the Imperium found us useful. Transport departs in 6 hours. Estimated voyage, 4 months subjective time. Your sanctum has been prepared according to standard specifications. The administratum will brief you on local protocols upon arrival. He slid a data slate across the desk without meeting my black glass eyes. The Emperor protects. The Emperor protects, I repeated by rote, taking the slate and leaving. The journey to Harvest 77 Secundus was suffocating in ways that had nothing to do with the ship's recycled air. I traveled aboard a merchant vessel, a massive bulk hauler called the Prophet's Theorem that transported agricultural equipment and gene seed for the world's vast farming complexes. The crew treated me like a plague victim, necessary but contaminating, useful but terrifying. They gave me a cabin in the aft section, as far from the crew quarters as the ship's architecture allowed. The captain visited once, a grizzled woman with augmetic eyes that clicked and refocused as she spoke, never quite looking at me directly. "We don't want any incidents," she said carefully. "The last psyker we transported had nightmares, bad ones. Screamed for 3 days straight before we had to sedate him. Crew got nervous. I'll remain in my cabin," I told her, my voice flat. After years of psychic communication, verbal speech felt crude, imprecise, like trying to paint with a shovel. "See that you do." She left quickly, sealing the door behind her with more force than necessary. I spent the 4-month voyage in isolation, meditating to keep my psychic presence minimal, practicing the exercises that kept my mind sharp and my defenses strong. Through the ship's hull, I could feel the warp pressing against the Geller field, closer here than near Terra, where millennia of psychic infrastructure and the Astronomican's light kept the boundary between realities more stable. Out here on the frontier, the membrane was thinner. I could sense things moving beyond it, tracking the ship's progress, waiting for any weakness. Twice during the voyage, I felt another Astropath's death scream echo through the warp, distant psychic detonations as minds elsewhere in the galaxy burned out or were snuffed out by violence. Each time I felt the psychic network adjust, other Astropaths automatically compensating for the lost nodes, messages rerouting through new paths. The system was redundant by design. We were expendable by design. When we finally translated back to real space at Harvest 77 Secundus, the relief was palpable among the crew. They couldn't feel the warp the way I could, but some primitive hindbrain instinct made them uneasy during warp travel. Now, in the relative safety of real space, they moved with renewed energy, eager to complete their delivery and be rid of their psychic passenger. The world below was unremarkable. A greenish-brown sphere covered in endless agricultural complexes, its land masses carved into geometric patterns of farmland that stretched from horizon to horizon. No natural wilderness remained. Every arable meter had been dedicated to food production, feeding the hungry mouths of forge worlds and hive worlds across the sector. It was efficient. It was necessary. It was utterly, depressingly lifeless. They shuttled me down to the planetary capital, a squat administrative city called Harvest Prime that served as the center of the world's bureaucratic apparatus. The city was small by imperial standards, perhaps 10 million souls, built around a central spire that housed the governor's palace, the administratum offices, and the astropathic sanctum. My sanctum. They led me through corridors of gray rockcrete and flickering lumens down into the sublevels where the psychically sensitive infrastructure was housed. The sanctum was exactly as the briefing had described, a reinforced chamber 3 levels below ground, its walls lined with psychic baffles and null runes etched into every surface. The air inside tasted of metal and ozone. A single chair sat in the center, more throne than seat, with neural interface ports and medical monitoring equipment built into its armrests. The previous primary's effects have been removed, said the administratum functionary who had escorted me. A thin man with the haunted eyes of someone who had seen his predecessor die badly. Your quarters are adjacent. Servitors will attend to your physical needs. Transmission schedules are on the slate. Any questions? No. He left quickly, sealing the sanctum door behind him. I heard the magnetic locks engage, not to keep me in, but to keep others out, to protect them from me, from what I might become if I lost control. I sat in the throne and felt the neural interfaces connect, cold metal sliding into the ports at the base of my skull. The sanctum systems came online. Psychic amplifiers and warp relays humming with barely contained power. Through them I could feel the network, the vast invisible web of astropaths scattered across the sector, each one a node of consciousness screaming into the void. I reached out, identifying myself, broadcasting my assignment and availability. Responses came immediately, other astropaths acknowledging my presence, updating their routing tables, relieving the neighboring nodes who had been compensating for my predecessor's absence. Welcome to the frontier, one of them sent, the psychic message carrying overtones of grim amusement. Try not to die too quickly. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. My days became routine with horrifying speed. Wake, meditate, sit in the throne and open myself to the warp. Receive messages. Fragmentary, pain-laden transmissions from across the sector. Tithe reports, supply manifests, casualty lists from guard regiments fighting Xenos incursions in neighboring systems. Requests for reinforcement, reports of unrest, the endless, grinding bureaucracy of the Imperium translated into psychic screams and hurled across the galaxy. Each reception felt like being stabbed through the forehead. Each transmission felt like giving birth through my skull. My nose bled constantly, my hands trembled. I lost weight despite the high-calorie rations the servitors brought me. But I functioned. I served. I kept the messages flowing. The messages were often mundane. The tedious data that kept the Imperium's machinery grinding forward. But occasionally, buried in the noise, I caught echoes of something darker. Warnings about increasing Xenos activity on the sector's edge. Reports of ships disappearing in the warp, whispers of unrest, of cult activity, of symbols appearing in places they shouldn't. And sometimes, late in the sleep cycle when my defenses were lowest, I would catch fragments of something else. Transmissions that weren't meant for me, that weren't encoded in any cipher I recognized, whispers in languages that made my mind itch. Promises, offers, seductions. I reported these to the local authorities, sending carefully worded warnings to the governor's office. They acknowledged receipt and did nothing. The tithes were being met. Production continued uninterrupted. Why investigate whispers and nightmares when the quotas were fulfilled? 3 years I served in that sanctum. 3 years of daily psychic trauma, of feeling my mind slowly eroding under the cumulative damage. 3 years of isolation. Speaking to no one except through psychic transmission, my only human contact, the silent servitors who brought food and removed waste. I began to understand why my predecessor had died. Why the 3 auxiliaries had died. This posting was a slow execution, Not dangerous enough to warrant additional support, but isolated enough that you felt every transmission in your bones, every message carving away another piece of your sanity. I started having dreams again, waking dreams, visions that bled through my meditation without warning. I saw figures in the underhive, people gathering in places they shouldn't, drawing symbols I shouldn't recognize, speaking names that made reality shudder when they were pronounced. I reported this too. And again, nothing was done. The corruption was already here, I realized, had been here for years, perhaps decades, growing slowly, carefully, staying just below the threshold of official notice. And I, soul-bound, psychically sensitive, isolated in my sanctum. I could feel it spreading like cancer through the world's population. I was a lighthouse, I began to understand. A psychic beacon burning bright in the warp, visible from vast distances to anything that knew how to look. And something was looking. Something had been looking for a long time, waiting patiently for the pieces to align, for the corruption to spread far enough, for the barriers to thin sufficiently. I tried to send warnings off-world, but my transmissions were troubled. They arrived garbled, incomplete, or not at all. Something was interfering with my messages, ensuring that no help would come, that this world would remain isolated and ignorant until it was too late. And I, locked in my sanctum, bound by duty and the Emperor's will burned into my psyche, could do nothing but watch as the darkness gathered and wait for the inevitable moment when it would finally break through. The Emperor protects, I whispered to myself in the darkness. But sometimes I was beginning to suspect the Emperor looks away. The visions began in my 4th year on Harvest 77 Secundus. At first I dismissed them as psychic bleed-through, the inevitable result of spending years with my mind open to the warp, receiving the fears and nightmares of millions of souls across the sector. But these were different, more focused, more intentional. They came not from distant sources, but from below, from the world itself, rising up through the rockcrete and psychic baffles like sewage through cracked pipes. I would be receiving a routine transmission, supply requisitions from a Forge world 3 systems away, and suddenly I would see them. Figures in hooded robes gathering in the agricultural complex's maintenance tunnels, symbols drawn in blood on durasteel walls, chanting in a language that my mind translated automatically even as it recoiled from the meaning. They were praying. Not to the Emperor, I knew those litanies, had heard them 10,000 times. These prayers went elsewhere. Down, not up. Into the warp's deepest, darkest places where things older than humanity waited with infinite patience for an opening. I reported it. Filed formal warnings with the governor's office, the Arbites, the local ministorum representatives. I described the symbols, the locations, the psychic turbulence I was detecting. I begged them to investigate, to purge, to act before it was too late. The governor's response came via official communiqué. Production continues uninterrupted. Tithe quotas exceeded by 3.7%. No evidence of heretical activity detected by conventional means. Astropath's concerns noted and dismissed. They thought I was mad, or lying, or seeing threats that didn't exist because my damaged mind could no longer distinguish reality from nightmare. I was a tool that had served too long, they implied. Perhaps I should request reassignment. Perhaps I should consider whether my usefulness had ended. I couldn't leave. There were no replacement astropaths available. The network was stretched thin. Too many worlds, too few soul-bound psychers, too many dying faster than they could be replaced. I was trapped here, locked in my sanctum, forced to watch as the corruption spread and no one would listen. The murders started 3 months after my first report. 14 bodies found in the underhive, arranged in a geometric pattern that made my psychic senses scream when I brushed against the residual emotional imprint. They hadn't just been killed. They had been sacrificed. Their deaths had meaning, had purpose, had torn small holes in reality through which something had briefly peered before the universe's natural defenses sealed the breach. Now they investigated. Now the Arbites deployed in force, sweeping the underhive, looking for the perpetrators. They found nothing. No witnesses, no evidence. The killers had vanished like smoke, leaving only the corpses and the symbols drawn in their blood. But I felt it. Felt the warp's presence growing stronger around the world, like storm clouds gathering before a hurricane. The barriers were thinning. Each murder, each ritual, each prayer to the dark gods, they were weakening the membrane between realities, creating pressure points where the immaterium could bleed through. The visions grew worse, more vivid, more intrusive. I would be in my meditation, maintaining my mental defenses, when suddenly I would be there, seeing through the eyes of cultists as they performed their rituals. Feeling their ecstasy, their devotion, their absolute certainty that what they were doing was right and necessary and holy. Some of them were Guard. Imperial Guard soldiers stationed on-world, supposedly loyal defenders of humanity, secretly gathering in the barracks sublevels to worship entities whose names could not be spoken aloud. I sent their identification codes to the military command. 3 days later, one of those soldiers shot his commanding officer and 17 others before being killed. The incident was classified as psychotic breakdown caused by combat stress. They still didn't see, didn't want to see, because seeing would mean acknowledging that the corruption had spread too far, that the purge required would devastate the planet's infrastructure and interrupt the tithes, and interrupting the tithes was unthinkable, so they ignored it. Rationalized it, filed reports that buried the truth under bureaucratic language until it seemed manageable, contained, under control. But I felt it every day. It grew stronger. The whispers started reaching me directly in my 5th year, not through visions or psychic bleed, actual, deliberate communication targeting my mind specifically. They came during my most vulnerable moments. When I was transmitting, my defenses lowered to channel messages through the warp, or during the sleep cycles when exhaustion dragged me under despite my training. "We see you, little lighthouse." The first time I heard them, I screamed so hard I ruptured blood vessels in my throat. The voice was legion, thousands speaking in unison, masculine and feminine, in things that were neither, tones that no human vocal cords could produce. It came from everywhere and nowhere, resonating through the warp and into my consciousness without any physical medium. "You burn so bright. You have suffered so much. We could end that suffering. We could give you sight, real sight, not this half-blind groping through shadows. We could make you whole." I reinforced my mental defenses, chanting litanies of protection, focusing on the Emperor's light burned into my psyche during soul binding. The voices faded but didn't disappear. They were always there now, waiting at the edges of my perception, probing for weaknesses. "You know they will not save this world. Your warnings go unheeded. Your sacrifice is meaningless. When the end comes, and it will come soon, you will burn with all the others unless you accept our gift." I reported this too. Described the demonic contact, the whispers, the deliberate targeting of my position. The response was swift. They sedated me. Injected me with psychic suppressants that dulled my abilities, made transmissions nearly impossible. Left me stumbling through my duties in a chemical haze that felt like drowning. They thought I was the problem. The corruption's vector, the weak link through which the enemy would pour, so they drugged me, restrained me during sleep cycles, had servitors monitor me constantly for signs of possession or heretical behavior. But the whispers continued. The drugs couldn't stop them. Nothing could stop them because they weren't attacking from outside. They were rising from below, from the planet itself, where the cult had grown so large and so deeply rooted that the warp's presence was becoming endemic. The planetary populace was dreaming wrong. I felt it through the psychic miasma. 4 billion minds experiencing nightmares simultaneously. The same symbols appearing in billions of sleeping consciousnesses. The same whispered names repeated by people who woke with no memory of speaking them. Mass psychosis, the authorities called it. Possibly a waterborne contaminant affecting neural chemistry. They started testing the aquifer systems, the air recyclers, looking for chemical causes because chemical causes could be fixed, could be addressed, could be managed through standard imperial protocols. They never looked at the temples in the underhive where thousands gathered nightly. Never investigated the manufacturum workers who had started chanting during their shifts. Never questioned why the suicide rate had tripled in 6 months, or why each suicide carved the same symbols into their flesh before dying. I watched it happen. Watched the world slide into damnation one day at a time, while the authorities filed reports and maintained their quotas and pretended that everything was under control. In my sanctum, alone with my throne and my madness and the voices that wouldn't stop whispering, I finally understood the truth. I hadn't been assigned here by accident. This posting wasn't administrative oversight or bureaucratic indifference. I had been placed here deliberately. The cult had infiltrated high enough, far enough, that they could influence astropathic assignments, could ensure that when Harvest 77 Secundus needed a replacement, they got me. Young enough to last, strong enough to burn bright, isolated enough to be easily monitored and neutralized if I realized too soon. I was the beacon, the lighthouse, the psychic flame drawing something massive and terrible through the warp toward this world. Everything. The murders, the rituals, the spreading corruption. It was all preparation. Building toward a moment when the barriers would finally fail completely and whatever had been watching for decades would finally be able to push through. And there was nothing I could do to stop it. They had me drugged, restrained, monitored. My warnings were dismissed, my messages were intercepted or altered before they reached anyone who might act. I was trapped in the sanctum that was supposed to be my sanctuary, watching the apocalypse approach one day at a time. Soon, the voices whispered, very soon now, and when the moment comes, you may still choose. You may still be saved. All you need do is stop resisting, stop clinging to the corpse god who abandoned you. Accept our gifts and you will know power beyond imagining. I screamed into the warp, a broad-spectrum psychic cry for help, throwing every scrap of power I possessed into one desperate transmission. Help us. Harvest 77 Secundus, demonic corruption, imminent breach. Please. The message tore through me like a chainsaw, ripping psychic channels that weren't meant to handle such stress. I felt things rupture inside my head, felt blood vessels burst, felt my nervous system overload and start shutting down. Through the haze of agony, I felt the message transmit, felt it rocket through the warp toward the nearest inquisitorial outpost, and felt it be intercepted halfway, pulled down and torn apart by forces that had been waiting for exactly this attempt. No help was coming. The Emperor had abandoned us, or perhaps, and this thought was most terrible of all, he had simply never cared in the first place. It began on a Sunday. I still tracked the days, still clung to that small marker of routine even as everything else dissolved into madness. I felt the warp breach before it manifested physically, a psychic scream that tore through my consciousness like a jagged blade, so loud and overwhelming that I actually lost awareness for several seconds, my mind simply unable to process the magnitude of what was happening. When I came back to myself, I was on the floor of my sanctum, blood pouring from my nose and ears. The throne's neural interfaces had disconnected, emergency protocols engaging to prevent permanent damage. Klaxons were wailing somewhere above, their distant shriek adding to the sensory chaos. Through my warp sight, I watched reality tear. The cult had timed their rituals perfectly, synchronizing thousands of simultaneous sacrifices across the planet. In the underhive, in the manufactorums, in the agricultural complexes, even in the governor's palace, everywhere their corruption had spread, they struck at once. Blood poured out in rivers, psychic energy building to critical mass, and the barriers between the material universe and the immaterium simply failed. Rifts opened, wounds in space-time that bled impossible colors, through which things began to pour. I felt every other astropath on the planet die in that first moment. 3 auxiliaries who had been assigned to secondary cities, their minds not strong enough to withstand the psychic shockwave, simply exploded. I felt their consciousness disintegrate, felt their death screams echo through the warp before being swallowed by the larger cacophony. I survived. My decades of torture, my soul binding, my years of daily psychic trauma, they had calcified my consciousness into something that could endure what should have been instantly lethal. I remained aware, remained functional, even as I felt the planet's psychic atmosphere ignite around me. The demons came through the rifts like a flood through broken levees. I couldn't see them with physical eyes, I had none, but my warp sight showed them in terrible clarity. Entities of living nightmare, creatures whose forms violated the laws of physics and biology, made of emotion and malice, and the fundamental wrongness of the warp given shape and purpose. Some were small, lesser entities that tore through the population like wolves through sheep, feeding on terror and flesh with equal hunger. Others were massive, towering things of brass and bone, of diseased flesh, of writhing appendages and screaming faces, each one a manifestation of one of the dark god's infinite aspects. The Imperial Guard regiment stationed on-world tried to respond. I felt their initial deployments, their commanders barking orders, their soldiers racing to defensive positions. Then I felt the betrayal as cultists within their ranks revealed themselves. Officers shooting their subordinates, weapons turned against the Emperor's soldiers by the very men who should have wielded them in his name. The defensive lines collapsed within hours. Not because the Guard lacked courage or firepower, but because they had been sabotaged from within. Their command structure compromised, their supply lines cut by traitors who had spent years working their way into positions of trust. I tried to maintain some semblance of functionality, tried to send warnings, but the psychic atmosphere was chaos now. Every transmission attempt was overwhelmed by the noise, the screaming of billions of souls experiencing torments beyond mortal comprehension, the roaring of demons feeding on the carnage, the laughter of the dark gods as another world fell into their grasp. My sanctum became my prison. The psychic null fields that had been designed to protect me from external influences now trapped me inside, unable to leave without being instantly overwhelmed by the demonic presence saturating the world. The servitors that had attended me were dead. I could feel their blank, peaceful minds simply stop as something found them outside the sanctum's protection. I was alone. The siege began on the second day. I felt them gathering outside, cultists and demons both drawn to my presence, eager to claim the prize they had worked so hard to prepare. The sanctum's doors were reinforced, built to withstand assault, but I could hear them working at the barriers, hear them chanting, hear machinery being brought to bear, hear the scraping of claws on metal and the whispers that promised terrible things if I would only open the door and let them in. "You cannot win," the voices told me. "Your emperor cannot hear you. Your messages go nowhere. This world is ours now, and you are the last light left burning. When we extinguish you, the darkness will be complete." I sent one final transmission. Not a message, but a scream. A broad-spectrum psychic death cry encoded with our coordinates in a single word. Exterminatus. The effort tore through me like a hurricane. I felt organs rupture, felt blood vessels burst throughout my body, felt my already damaged nervous system begin shutting down under the impossible strain. But I held nothing back. I burned every scrap of life force I possessed, threw my entire being into that final message, praying to the Emperor I wasn't certain existed anymore that someone would hear, that someone would understand, that this world's death might at least prevent the corruption from spreading further. The transmission launched. I felt it rocket away through the warp, carrying the coordinates and the desperate plea for cleansing fire. Then I collapsed. The throne's medical systems engaging automatically, trying to keep me alive even as my body began the process of dying. 3 days I endured in that sanctum while they worked at the doors. 3 days of listening to them promise me relief, promise me power, promise me anything if I would only surrender. 3 days of maintaining the distress beacon, using what remained of my consciousness to keep broadcasting our location, keep screaming into the void that we needed help, needed intervention, needed the Emperor's mercy, even if that mercy came in the form of total annihilation. My body was failing. I could feel it shutting down one system at a time. Kidneys first, then liver, then my digestive tract simply giving up. Blood wept from every orifice. My skin split in places where blood vessels had ruptured so catastrophically that the pressure had no other outlet. I was dying by degrees, my life measured in hours now rather than years. But I maintained the beacon. It was the only thing I could still do, the last service I could render. So I did it. On the 3rd day, I felt them breach the sanctum's outer defenses, felt the psychic null fields flicker and fail as the cultists' machinery finally overwhelmed the ancient systems. The inner door was all that remained between me and them. I heard them on the other side, heard their celebration, heard the demons shrieking in anticipation of finally claiming the prize they had worked so hard to isolate. I had perhaps an hour left before they broke through. An hour before they dragged me from my throne and did whatever they intended. Possession, corruption, transformation into something that would serve their dark masters. I tried to pray, tried to recite the litanies I had learned, tried to call upon the Emperor's light that had been burned into my soul during the soul binding. But the words wouldn't come. My faith, whatever faith I had once possessed, had burned away along with everything else, consumed in years of suffering and unanswered prayers. All I had left was duty, the simple mechanical imperative to keep broadcasting until I physically couldn't anymore. So that's what I did. As the inner door began to buckle, as I felt the demons pressing their consciousness against mine in anticipation, as the cultists' chanting reached a fever pitch, I broadcast the coordinates one more time. Please, I thought into the void. Not a prayer, I was past prayers, just a simple request from one broken tool to whatever might be listening. Please let my death mean something. The door exploded inward, and I kept broadcasting. They came on the 6th day. I felt them before I saw them, a cold and sharp presence in the warp that cut through the demonic chaos like a blade through diseased flesh. Imperial vessels, translating in-system with their guns already hot, their purpose absolute and uncompromising. Through my warp sight, I watched them emerge from the immaterium. A small fleet, 3 cruisers, 2 destroyers, and a battle barge bearing the insignia of the Inquisition. They didn't hail the planet, didn't request information or attempt negotiation. They had received my transmission, had decoded its meaning, and had come not to rescue but to cleanse. The cultists in my sanctum felt it too. I sensed their sudden uncertainty, their chanting faltering as they looked upward through meters of rockcrete toward the doom descending from orbit. Some of them fled. The demons, unable to leave the material realm once manifested without host bodies or specific rituals, simply intensified their assault on my position, desperate to claim their prize before it was denied them. I was past caring. My body had failed so completely that I existed now as little more than consciousness trapped in dying meat, kept aware only by the throne's medical systems and my own stubborn refusal to let go until the end. Blood filled my lungs, my heart beat irregularly, missing beats, stuttering, failing. I could no longer feel my extremities, but I could still see through the warp, could still watch what was coming. The fleet deployed no landing craft, sent no assault teams. They hadn't come to reclaim the world. They had come to ensure the corruption died here, that it spread no further, that Harvest 77 Secundus would serve as a firebreak preventing the demonic incursion from spreading to neighboring systems. I watched the cyclonic torpedoes launch, massive weapons designed for one purpose: planetary annihilation. They descended through the atmosphere in slow, beautiful arcs, their warheads containing payloads that would ignite the air itself, crack the crust, render the world uninhabitable for millennia. In my sanctum, the demons shrieked as they realized what was coming. The cultists wailed, their certainty crumbling, their dark gods either unable or unwilling to save them from the Emperor's final judgment. They had promised power, had promised ascension, had promised that service would be rewarded. They had lied. I felt a moment of satisfaction at that, petty, small, but real. They were dying too. Everyone who had ignored my warnings, who had dismissed my reports, who had let the corruption spread because acknowledging it was inconvenient, they would burn alongside the traitors and the innocent alike. The mathematics of imperial governance I understood now. An entire world, 4 billion souls, centuries of infrastructure, strategic value in agricultural production, all of it expendable to contain the taint. Better to lose one world than risk losing a sector. Better to kill billions than allow the corruption to spread. It was logical, necessary, the only choice that preserved humanity's long-term survival. It was also monstrous. The first torpedo struck on the western continent. I felt the detonation through the warp, a blast of heat and light and kinetic energy that vaporized everything within hundreds of kilometers instantly. The shock wave propagated outward at hypersonic speeds, tearing through atmospheric layers, igniting the air itself into a firestorm that would consume everything combustible. More torpedoes fell. The eastern continent, the northern polar manufactorums, the southern ocean platform cities, each one a miniature sun, each one erasing millions of lives in microseconds. My sanctum, deep beneath Harvest Prime, offered no protection. The city above vaporized first, the governor and his bureaucrats and all the functionaries who had ignored my warnings dying without ever understanding why. Then the shockwave reached the sublevels, traveling through the rockcrete faster than sound, faster than thought. The pressure wave hit my sanctum like the fist of an angry god. The walls cracked, the ceiling collapsed. The throne that had been my prison and my purpose for 5 years shattered, neural interfaces tearing free, taking pieces of my skull with them. I should have died then. Should have been crushed or burned or simply torn apart by the forces being unleashed. But I didn't die. Not physically. Not yet. Instead, I felt my consciousness separate. Felt my psychic essence tear loose from my disintegrating body as the flesh burned away, as the bones shattered, as everything physical that had been me was reduced to its constituent atoms and scattered across the dying world. I was dying, yes. But my death wasn't the end. My psychic essence, no longer anchored to flesh, drifted upward through the layers of reality. I could see the planet below, or what remained of it. The atmosphere was igniting, turning the entire world into a fireball. The crust was fracturing, tectonic plates shifting and buckling under the strain of multiple cyclonic impacts. Oceans boiled, cities melted, Everything humanity had built here across centuries of colonization was being unmade in minutes. And I could see the warp, see it clearly now, without the filter of physical perception or the limitations of meat-bound consciousness. It roared around the dying world like a hurricane, feeding on the terror and agony of billions of souls being violently separated from their bodies. The demons gorged themselves on the psychic feast, growing fat on suffering before being dragged back through the closing rifts as the material anchors of the cult's rituals were destroyed. I should have dispersed, should have dissolved into the warp, my consciousness fragmenting and dissipating like smoke in wind. But I didn't dissipate either. Instead, I felt a pull, a beacon shining across the galaxy, golden and terrible and absolutely impossible to resist. The Astronomican, the psychic lighthouse burning on holy Terra, powered by the Emperor's will and the sacrifice of 10,000 psychers daily, guiding ships through the warp and calling to souls like mine. I tried to resist, tried to let myself fade, to find whatever peace might exist for psychic entities in dissolution. But the pull was inexorable. The Emperor's will, the same will that had been burned into my consciousness during soul binding, wouldn't let me go. I was his tool still, even in death. Especially in death. My psychic essence was drawn across the galaxy, pulled through the warp toward Terra at speeds that made real space navigation seem glacial by comparison. I saw other souls being drawn the same way, psychers dying across the Imperium, their consciousness being harvested, being collected, being added to the great psychic engine that kept humanity's empire functioning. We screamed, all of us, screamed in voices that had no sound, in languages that predated speech, in frequencies that no living being could hear. We were being consumed, being fed into the machinery of the Imperium's survival. Our individuality dissolved to fuel the greater purpose. I felt myself approaching Terra, felt the Astronomican's pull growing stronger, its light growing brighter until it was all I could perceive, blinding, annihilating, infinite. I was drawn down through the atmosphere, through the layers of the Imperial Palace, into the depths where the Golden Throne sat and the Emperor maintained his eternal vigil. And I was fed into the machinery, fed into the choir of souls that powered the Astronomican, fed into the psychic furnace that burned constantly, consuming psycher essences by the thousands to maintain the beacon that guided humanity through the darkness. I became fuel, became one voice in a chorus of billions, our individual identities subsumed into the greater whole. Our consciousness stretched and tortured and burned slowly across centuries to power the Emperor's great work. This is the fate of all astropaths, I understood now with perfect, terrible clarity. We serve in agony, we die in flames, and we scream forever in the soul engines of the Imperium, our essence consumed to keep the light burning, to keep the Imperium connected, to keep humanity surviving one more day in a universe that wants nothing more than to devour it completely. The Emperor protects, they had told us. The Emperor protects. But from him, from his purposes, from his cold mathematics, from his absolute utilitarian calculus that measured all existence in terms of humanity's survival regardless of the cost, there is no protection. There never was. There never will be. I burn now in the Astronomican, have burned for, I don't know. Time is meaningless here. Years, centuries, millennia. My consciousness is stretched so thin, diluted across such vast scales that I can barely maintain the coherence necessary to remember who I once was. But I remember Harvest 77 Secundus. Remember my mother's face before they took me. Remember the 12-year-old child who thought his life would be lived in the hive, who never imagined the horrors that awaited him, who couldn't conceive of the suffering that service to the Imperium would demand. I remember, and I scream, and I burn, And the Emperor, enthroned in gold and locked in eternal war against the darkness, neither hears nor cares about my suffering, because I am doing my duty, serving my purpose, keeping the light burning. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, and there is only service, and there is only the slow, agonizing consumption of every soul that bears the psychic gift, burned away in the Emperor's name to fuel the Imperium's survival. The Emperor protects, but no one protects us from the Emperor. This is the truth they never tell you when the black ships come. This is the fate that awaits all who are marked as Psychically, service, suffering, sacrifice, and screaming forever in the dark.